Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to introduce or reintroduce the notion of international trade in macroeconomics. The two parts, the first part is kind of just some explanation of generally why free trade is good and a few of the drawbacks of it. So that's the first half. There's a little bit of talking there. The second half, we're going to draw a picture of the circular flow model that includes all the different parts of the global economy. So let's get started. So in this first lecture, we're really just going to first at the top kind of look at general benefits and drawbacks of trade. And if you remember thinking back all the way back to Unit 1 in microeconomics, we've talked about trade being beneficial because what it primarily allows us to do is focus on what we are good at, right? And if I focus on what I am good at, that is to say, I have the least opportunity cost. I have the lowest opportunity cost. I give up the least. If I focus on what I'm good at and you focus on what you're good at, you have the lowest opportunity cost. You give up the least. And then we actually can trade with each other for the amount of the other thing that we don't produce ourselves. That phenomena allows us to both consume more than what we could do all by ourselves. So ultimately, trade, which is described more than 200 years ago by the Spanish economist David Ricardo, he was a Jewish economist from Spain, and what he observed was that this trade relationship can make both parties better off than they otherwise could do by themselves. And it's a real direct opposition to the notion of mercantilism, to the notion that trade is zero sum, that I win and you lose. That's not how trade works. And mutually beneficial exchanges, trade, really do have the ability to raise global output. So from an internationalist perspective, all those principles still apply, but it actually allows us to have more things overall for the entire planet, which again, more output is higher standards of living per person. There are some other benefits that the kind of economists would center on in terms of the benefits of trade from an international perspective. Trade can spread innovations, which would obviously speed productivity and growth rates. So trade facilitates growth in a couple of different ways, and that's one of them. Another one is that it increases competition. When we trade with one another, it actually forces us to get better, right? If I'm protected from the world and I don't have to, my industry, maybe it's steel, right? And I don't have to worry about foreign competition, then I don't really have to get better. And so as a result, I stagnate. But if I have more competitors, it's going to force me to innovate. It's going to force me to be more efficient, and that's going to yield a greater variety of goods at lower prices. And that we do see lots of evidence of that. We also know that when we have large-scale trade networks, that can produce economies of scale, right? In Unit 3 of microeconomics, we talked about the LRATC, the long-run average cost curve, and that as companies get larger, they can kind of take advantage of various ways of streamlining their operations and lower average costs. And those lower costs will turn into lower prices for consumers, right? It's more efficient use of resources. Trade also allows for international flows of money, where savings can go to where it's put to its best and highest use. In other words, if I'm an American and I'm saving money, maybe if America is the best and highest use of my money, great. But what if it's Japan? Then international trade allows me to save my money and put my money into the Japanese loanable funds market. It allows me to lend my money there where it's going to be put to its best and highest use. So international trade can let our money be used more efficiently even. And last, trade typically correlates with greater degrees of global cooperation. This is more of a poli-sci benefit than it is an economic benefit. But I think we can't deny that more stability is also good for economics, right? You know, we think about business environments depend on stable, predictable things. And when we have conflict, that interrupts that. So trade can actually provide the spillover benefit of smoothing out conflicts and encouraging cooperation. Now, on the downsides, right, the downsides are often more about a specific group or a specific industry that's being affected in a way. The benefits are usually more broadly applied. The downsides are specific. So thinking about a specific one, free trade typically harms local industries, right? You think about it this way. If I now have to compete with the rest of the world, maybe my costs of production are just too high. An example of that, in the last 30 years, being a shrimp boat captain in America has been really tough. That's because as the US has done more free trade with the world, we've been able to buy cheap shrimp that's produced all around the world and frozen and shipped here. But if you're a shrimp boat captain in Bayou La Batterie, Alabama, it's been a lot harder because the price that you have to compete with is so low that you might even not be able to produce. And so that comparative advantage part works both ways. It maybe says, well, maybe the US shouldn't produce quite as much shrimp all by itself. Maybe we should just buy farmed shrimp from elsewhere. And again, that can create some structural unemployment. What about the shrimp boat captain? What's he go do for a job, right? What's he supposed to do? So it kind of creates those issues, right? Second is that trade pretty commonly, and especially in developed countries, free trade and allowing imports and exports often benefits the people who can buy those cheap imported goods. But it's a downside for the people who work in the industries that produce those things. So this is kind of related to the first bullet point, but it's basically saying that it creates this bifurcation between different socioeconomic groups in our countries. And we saw that documentary in class about inequality. It's one of the fueling things. Globalization has fueled inequality within developed countries. The United States has seen working class Americans' wages stay pretty flat, while well-educated, highly skilled Americans, their pay has been rising, and they're able to take advantage of lower prices for goods, right? Just as a little example of that, the real price of footwear in the United States has basically not changed in 25 years. It's the cheapest it's ever been to buy a pair of shoes in America, which is great if you want to buy shoes, right? But it's not so great if you used to work in the shoe factory. And there used to be hundreds of shoe factories all across America making shoes. So that has created some of that inequality that we talk about. Some other things here, that movement of international capital flow, allowing money to flow where it's used most efficiently, can sometimes mean that an economy can get really dependent on foreign borrowing. In the case of the United States, about a third of our national debt is actually held by foreigners. And that can create some financial instability if those foreigners, say, decided they didn't want to hold on to our debt anymore. Developing industries often struggle against more established global competitors. This is related to the harming local industries, but it's basically saying, let's say you're a less developed economy where it's mostly been about farming and mining. And so you don't have a whole lot of factories. Well, if the factory countries, the more developed countries, if they're constantly dumping their goods on your country, then you're never going to be able to develop a local industry that will produce those same things. So it kind of holds back the growth progress of a lot of less developed countries. And we've known that for 200 years, right? Britain was the factory of the world in the 1800s, and they often used their colonies, like India, as a place to sell those goods and services. And what it did is it prevented those colonies, like India, from developing even farther in terms of their industrial process. And it absolutely harmed local industries like weaving and textile making. There's a big part of why Mohandas K. Gandhi advocated that Indian people, for example, make their own cloth, was because they wanted to break that dependency and allow India to develop on its own. A lot of free trade can also create these kind of supply chains, right? Where you're depending on a thing made in another country, made in another country, made in another country, and that can get really vulnerable to disruptions. That can happen too, though, if you're trying to make the things all yourself. We saw that in the United States with baby formula. In the last couple of years, baby formula, there was a contamination incident at the only factory really that made baby formula in America. And we were kind of depending on ourselves for baby formula. Well, the absence of free trade actually bit us on that one, because when there was a contamination incident at that factory, then all of a sudden there are massive shortages of baby formula. So maybe there's a middle ground, and between having these really complicated supply chains where you're trying to depend on dozens of places, but also maybe having a little bit of trade because you don't want to do it all yourself. The last point here about recessions spreading quicker and more broadly is mostly actually about the factory kind of countries rather than the ones that are buying the stuff. So in the United States' case, we actually buy quite a bit from other countries, even though we export quite a bit as well. And so we actually end up creating the recessions that spread somewhere else. For example, Vietnam makes a huge amount of, say, undergarments and socks and things like that for the United States. And so when the US goes into a recession, like if we lose consumer confidence and Americans stop buying as much, well, they're not going to buy as many socks and undergarments and t-shirts. And so that could spread that recession to Vietnam. It hasn't really happened the other way, right? In the United States, we haven't really entered recessions because of global trade partners, but it can happen going the opposite end, that when we enter a recession, that can cause the others to do so. So it is a possible thing. And then the last thing about maybe generalized trade is just to remember specialization according to comparative advantage allows consuming beyond a PPC. This is really a fundamental concept. It's from Unit 1, and it is something that you got to be able to kind of articulate. Now, where we want to go next is kind of modeling what international trade looks like in a whole economy. And this is really going to draw everybody and everything in an economy. And what we're going to do is first draw kind of 4 boxes here. that represent the different agents or actors in the world. And then we're going to have 3 boxes. There's going to be 2 right here, and there's going to be 1 over here. And these are going to be the different kinds of markets that exist in the world. Now, the first time we talked about circular flow, we said there's households. I'm sorry, that doesn't quite fit in there. And there's firms. Those are the companies that do the producing. And we know that we've got factor markets. That's where firms hire the factors of production, like land, labor, and capital. And we've got product markets where firms supply goods and services, like haircuts and socks and undergarments and whatever. And that generally, in a most simplified economy, we would say that consumers spend money in product markets. That's the consumption spending. That sometimes firms will also spend money in there, but that all of the money that comes out to firms, right, because it's kind of like an on balance, is what we call gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is the value of basically all the dollars that are flowing into that product market. It's what that value amounts to. Now, the other side of this, we could say you've got income that flows back to those households. So what do those firms do with it? Well, some of it obviously gets spent in investment spending, but it mostly is going back to hiring the workers and hiring the machines and hiring the land and doing that, right? You're hiring your inputs. And so this is also GDP, right? It's the other way we calculate it, and we calculate it as the income approach: wages, rent, interest, and profit. And so it's really just 2 ways that we calculated GDP. Now, this is the most simplified model. And when we talked about it, I said, yeah, there's the government, and they also spend money in the product market, but we didn't add it. So now let's go ahead and do that. The government. Well, where does government first get its money from? And if you did the lesson in 9.2, you know that 93% of the money the government get comes from household taxes. In various forms, they collect taxes on American households. Now, 7% comes from firms, corporate income taxes. So if you wanted to, you could put a little line there, but I think then it gets really messy. And what do they do with those taxes? Well, they spend that money. And we know they go into the product markets and they buy stuff, because we know GDP is equal to CIG equals C plus I plus G plus XN. And we're going to get to that XN part in just a moment, right? So we have kind of this way of calculating GDP is all the dollars that are flowing into that product market. Now, the government sometimes, and I know this may shock you if you've been in this class a bit, sometimes takes more money out than it takes in terms of it spends more than it takes in. Outlays are greater than revenues is a fancy way to say that. And so as a result, many times they need to borrow. And where do they borrow? They borrow in what are called financial markets. And financial markets are really just the loanable funds market that we learned in 8.4. And so we know that where's the money come from? Well, it mostly comes from savings, households that save their money, put it into a bank, and that then it gets borrowed, right? Often by the government. Now, it's not exclusively borrowed by the government. In fact, the majority is not. The majority of it is actually borrowed by, borrowed by firms. So that arrow is going this way. The borrowing is going this way to firms. And what I like about this part of the diagram is that it really shows you, well, you've got savings from households flowing into financial markets. And then you've got kind of 2 spots that could go. It could go to the government or it could go to firms. And that's what crowding out really looks like, right? If this part, the borrowing up here gets bigger, then there's less borrowing that's available for the firms to do investment spending that would grow the economy. So that's the crowding out. Now, this whole thing that we've drawn here is what we would call the closed economy. This is everything if you didn't trade with the world. But every country around the world trades with other countries. And so we actually have another box, the world. Now, from the US's perspective, we actually have outflows on our product markets to the world. The money is flowing out, and we call that a trade deficit. This is a point where some students get a little bit mixed up because they think that this arrow means that we're selling things to the world. And we are selling things to the world. But net exports means exports minus imports. And actually this arrow flowing out means funds are flowing out of the country, right? So this is an outflow. Money's flowing out. That's what we call a trade deficit, that the United States basically is buying more from the world than we actually sell to the world. That money flowing out to the world. Now, it doesn't stop there, though, right? That would indicate that maybe the world will just keep accumulating this money, and then eventually we run out, right? This breaks the circular flow, and that's actually because there is another arrow that we need, and it's that those foreigners take that money and they do what's called capital flows. Capital flows. It's this part that we just talked about up here, allows for international capital flows, which funds investment more efficiently. And this is basically saying that the money that the US spends on goods and services that goes out to the world, it flows back into the United States in the form of spending from foreigners on our financial assets. So it's foreigners buying financial assets in the United States. And we would call this a capital surplus. And it's in fact such a true identity about this inflow outflow that this amount, the trade deficit, matches the capital surplus. They have to, by definition, but it is simply true that these dollars that we spend on goods and services from the world, they don't just get fed into a shredder. They come back in the form of capital flows. And next lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about what that looks like. But in short, what they're doing is they buy US stocks, they buy US real estate, and they invest in our government by lending us money. So they buy US bonds. And all of that we model via the loanable funds market. It's basically foreigners saying, oh, I have an extra $100 because Gloss bought a $100 radio from me. What am I going to do with this $100? I guess I'll buy a share of US stock, or I'll buy a US bond. I'll loan the government $100, the government of the United States. And those are beneficial for us, right, in a variety of ways. If they lend us money at low interest rates, that's a sign that they're willing to say, I'm going to lend that money right back to the US government. And then the government doesn't have to tax me as much to do the spending that we agree we like. If they're investing in our stock market, that boosts the value of my investments. It's good for my portfolio when other people want to buy the stocks that I own, and it's good for those companies. It fuels their investment. If those people want to buy real estate here in America, so much the better. It's good for the people who otherwise also own real estate here. And it's not like that, a Chinese businessman who buys a farm in the United States can pick that farm up and move it back to China. The productive capacity of the United States is not affected by when the Chinese businessman buys that farm. I know that this can get a little bit dicey and confusing. Important last thing to know is inflows and outflows, funds flowing in, funds flowing out. We're all talking about the money. And so as a result, I wanted ChatGPT to help you out with this, leaving you with this little poem that a large language model wrote for you about this notion that the dollars flow back into the US. The river gives water to the sea, and the sea returns rain to the river. What leaves must return, though the path may be unseen. Look at that little unseen path. The hand that gives also receives, for emptiness and fullness are one. Thank you, ChatGPT, my AI large language model. I hope this helped you with a basic introduction to trade. I'll see you next time.